The danger many Americans had been taught to imagine as foreign was, on that morning, already parked at the curb in Oklahoma City. It was a rented Ryder truck outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. It did not look like a declaration of war. It looked ordinary enough to belong to the workday, a vehicle in a downtown street near a federal office building in a city where people were arriving for appointments, opening offices, carrying papers, dropping off children, taking elevators, answering phones. But at approximately 9:02 in the morning on April 19, 1995, that truck became the mechanism of mass murder. The explosion tore through the north side of the Murrah Building with a force that would make the attack a defining case of domestic terrorism in the United States. 168 people were killed. 19 of them were children. Hundreds more were injured. The FBI and Britannica summarized the injured as more than 500. The Oklahoma Historical Society gives an approximate figure of 850. However counted, the number was not abstract to the people in the streets that morning. It was measured in bodies carried from rubble, in names read by families, in survivors whose lives were divided into before and after. The Murrah Building stood in downtown Oklahoma City, at the center of a normal weekday. The offices inside were federal, but the people inside were clerks, agents, parents, children, visitors, employees, and citizens. The building was not on a battlefield. It was part of the routine architecture of government, a place where federal agencies did the daily administrative work that most people notice only when they need it. That ordinariness is part of why the attack remains so difficult to absorb. The bombing did not come at night when the building was empty. It did not strike a symbolic monument from a distance. It struck during working hours when the building was alive. At 9:02, the blast did more than break windows. It opened the building. It destroyed most of the north half of the Murrah Building's rectangular footprint, according to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and caused roughly half of the usable space to collapse. What had been offices and hallways became exposed floors, hanging concrete, twisted steel, dust, smoke, paper, and silence broken by alarms and human voices. The violence reached beyond the building itself. The Oklahoma Historical Society reports that property damage affected more than 300 buildings in a 48-square-block area. Nearby structures were wrecked. Glass failed across the downtown area. The attack was local in its exact address, but its shock traveled outward almost instantly, through the city, through television and radio, through federal agencies, through families waiting for phone calls, through a country trying to understand what had just happened. For many people watching from elsewhere, the first question was who? In that first confusion, suspicion wrongly focused on Middle Eastern terrorist groups, as Britannica notes. The Oklahoma Historical Society describes how early media accusations against Islamic terrorists contributed to 2 days of anti-Muslim hysteria. That detail matters because it shows how the country initially reached for a familiar fear and was wrong. The danger in Oklahoma City had not arrived from overseas. The investigation would move toward Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, former United States Army soldiers, and toward a violent anti-government extremism already rooted inside the country. But at 9:02, no one in the dust knew the full architecture of the plot. No one had yet named the FBI investigation OKBOMB. No one had yet traced the rear axle of the Ryder truck back toward Junction City, Kansas. No one had yet understood the meaning of the traffic stop that put McVeigh in custody shortly after the bombing, before he was identified as the bombing suspect. Those facts would come later, piece by piece, through one of the largest federal investigations of its time. The first fact was the blast. A truck bomb had exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The device was concealed in a rental truck. The Oklahoma Historical Society describes it as an ammonium nitrate and fuel oil bomb weighing approximately 4,800 pounds. Britannica describes the explosive charge as more than 2 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil. The exact technical language would matter to investigators and engineers. To the people downtown, the result was immediate destruction. In the aftermath, rescue workers and civilians moved toward the building, not away from it. Survivors emerged, coated in dust. Some were bleeding. Some were unable to speak. Others searched for coworkers, parents, children, friends. The building itself had become unstable and exposed, and the work of rescue unfolded in a place where danger had not ended when the sound of the explosion faded. The death toll would settle at 168. That number is now inseparable from the Oklahoma City National Memorial, where 168 empty chairs stand on the footprint of the Murrah Building. The chairs are arranged in 9 horizontal rows, representing the 9 floors of the federal building. 5 chairs sit outside the main pattern to honor the 5 people killed outside the building. The memorial gives the number a shape. It makes absence visible. But on April 19th, the country did not yet have a memorial. It had a cratered street, a shattered federal building, and a city searching the rubble. It had families arriving downtown because they could not get answers by telephone. It had hospitals receiving the injured. It had law enforcement trying to secure a scene that was at once a rescue site, a crime scene, and a national trauma. The bombing forced a recognition that would define the years that followed. Terrorism in the United States was not only something imagined as arriving from outside the country's borders. It could grow from domestic grievance, from hatred of the federal government, from an ideology that treated public servants and civilians as acceptable targets. The FBI later stated that McVeigh's hatred of the federal government intensified after the 1993 Waco standoff, where 76 people died, and that he went to Waco during the standoff and distributed anti-government literature. That context does not explain away the crime. It locates it in a documented landscape of radicalization and violence. The Oklahoma City bombing also exposed a dangerous contradiction in national perception. The federal building was a symbol of government power, but many of the victims were people with no power over the grievances claimed by the attackers. The children killed in the bombing did not write federal policy. The office workers did not command armed standoffs. The visitors and employees inside the building did not choose to become symbols. They were made into targets by men who had decided that their rage justified mass death. This is why the time matters. 9:02 is not just a timestamp. It is the moment a workday became evidence. It is the point at which an ordinary truck, an ordinary street, and an ordinary federal building were transformed into proof of a threat the country had not fully recognized. The attack killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured hundreds more. It damaged buildings across downtown Oklahoma City. It set off a vast investigation. It reshaped public memory, federal security, law enforcement, and the language Americans use to talk about terrorism. Yet the fullest understanding begins with the place itself, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, the agencies inside it, the surrounding streets, and the neighboring buildings that absorbed the force of the blast. To understand what was destroyed at 9:02, it is necessary to know what had stood there before the truck arrived on Northwest 5th Street. Before the truck arrived on Northwest 5th Street, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was not a symbol in the way it would later become one. It was a place of appointments, paperwork, badges, elevators, office doors, waiting rooms, and ordinary federal business. Its name belonged to the geography of downtown Oklahoma City and to the people who worked there, visited there, or passed it on their way through the city's center. The Murrah Building stood in the area of 200 Northwest 5th Street. It was a federal office building, part of the everyday infrastructure of government outside Washington, D.C. That detail matters because the target was not a military base or a remote installation. It was a civilian workplace in the middle of a city. Federal agencies had regional offices inside that. People went there for services, investigations, meetings, and administrative work. It was one of the places where the national government met the public face-to-face. Associated Press reporting identified offices in the building for agencies including the Social Security Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. There was also a credit union. Those names tell us something about the building's function. It was not one institution. It was many institutions under one roof, each carrying a different meaning for the people who entered. The Social Security Administration represented benefits, records, and the long bureaucratic chain between individual lives and federal systems. The FBI represented federal law enforcement. The Secret Service carried its own law enforcement and protective mission. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was another federal enforcement agency, one that would later become especially important, and how the bombing was interpreted within the wider story of anti-government extremism. And the credit union added another layer of ordinariness: deposits, accounts, workplace finances, the business of daily life. In that sense, the Murrah Building was both visible and routine. It stood for federal authority, but also for errands and jobs. A person might enter because they worked for the government. Another might arrive because they needed help with a benefit. Another because they had business with a credit union. The same building could mean employment, public service, law enforcement, paperwork, or waiting in line. That mixture is part of what made the destruction so devastating. The blast did not strike an abstraction. It struck a dense human setting. The agencies inside were not just agency names. They were offices staffed by people and visited by people inside a building that had become part of the downtown workday. The building also belonged to a street grid. Northwest 5th Street was not an empty border around a federal site. It was part of a neighborhood of office buildings and civic activity. The force of the explosion would show how closely connected those structures were. The damage did not stop at the walls of the Murrah Building. It moved outward into the surrounding blocks, carrying glass, pressure, debris, and shock through downtown Oklahoma City. The National Park Service identifies nearby structures across Northwest 5th Street that were wrecked after the blast, including the Athenian Office Building and the Oklahoma Water Resources Building. Both were eventually imploded. Those details are easy to pass over because the Murrah Building is rightly the center of the story. But the neighboring buildings help us understand the scale of what happened. The truck was placed outside one building, but the damage entered a district. The Athenian Office Building and the Oklahoma Water Resources Building were not merely damaged in a cosmetic way. The National Park Service describes them as wrecked. Their later implosion shows that the bombing changed the physical map of the area. Buildings that had stood as part of the downtown landscape were removed because they could not simply return to what they had been. The Journal Record Building also became part of the visible aftermath. The National Park Service notes blast effects on its southern wall. That surviving evidence is important because it gives the area a kind of archive in stone and masonry. In a bombing investigation, fragments matter. In public memory, damaged walls matter too. They record force in a way that words alone cannot. The Oklahoma Historical Society reports that property damage affected more than 300 buildings in a 48-square-block area. That figure widens the lens. The bombing was centered on the Murrah Building, but downtown Oklahoma City absorbed it across blocks of offices, streets, windows, and interiors. The phrase property damage can sound cold, but in this case it points to the lived environment of a city suddenly altered. More than 300 buildings meant more than 300 points of impact: blown-out windows, damaged walls, disrupted workplaces, closed offices, and spaces that became unsafe or unusable. After the bombing, the area around the Murrah Building was not simply a crime scene. It was an urban wound. The Federal Building, the nearby offices, the civic buildings, and the surrounding blocks had all become part of the same event. Some structures would survive with scars. Others would be taken down. The National Park Service says 16 buildings in total were taken down after the bombing. That number shows that the attack's physical consequences lasted beyond the morning of April 19th. Demolition, assessment, and removal became part of the aftermath. The Murrah Building itself would later be remembered through the Oklahoma City National Memorial. The memorial includes 168 empty chairs on the footprint of the building. The National Park Service says the 9 horizontal rows of chairs represent the 9 floors of the federal building. The pattern of the memorial preserves the building's vertical life in a horizontal field. It translates floors into rows, offices into absence, and a workday into a place of remembrance. 5 of the chairs are placed outside the main organizational pattern to honor the 5 people killed outside the Murrah Building. That arrangement makes clear that the building's story cannot be limited to its interior. Some victims were outside. The street itself was part of the event. Northwest 5th Street was not just the location of the truck. It was part of the human geography of the bombing. The survivor wall also carries material from the original place. It contains the names of survivors within a 2-block radius and incorporates 4 granite slabs salvaged from the Murrah Building. Those slabs matter because they are not replicas or symbols invented later. They are pieces of the building that stood there. They connect the memorial to the physical structure that was destroyed and to the surrounding area that was damaged. To understand the Murrah Building, then, is to understand several things at once. It was a federal office building. It housed agencies with public, financial, investigative, and enforcement functions. It stood on Northwest 5th Street in downtown Oklahoma City, surrounded by other buildings close enough to be wrecked or scarred by the same blast. And after the attack, its footprint became a place where the dead, the survivors, the building, and the street were all remembered together. This is why the location cannot be treated as background. The attackers chose a place where federal authority had a public address. But the blast moved through far more than an address. It moved through offices, a credit union, nearby buildings, sidewalks, windows, and streets. It turned the architecture of ordinary government work into the architecture of mass casualty and investigation. By the time investigators and rescue workers were moving through the ruins, the Murrah Building had already become evidence. So had Northwest 5th Street. So had the neighboring structures that had been wrecked, damaged, or destabilized. The shape of the destruction would matter. The position of the vehicle would matter. And at the center of that evidence was the rented Ryder truck that had looked, before 9:02, like one more ordinary vehicle at the curb. The rented truck mattered because it was both ordinary and catastrophic. On Northwest 5th Street, near the north side of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, it could appear as part of the morning cityscape, a commercial vehicle parked close to a federal office building at the edge of a workday already underway. After 9:02, that same vehicle became the central object in the crime scene, the point from which investigators, engineers, and historians would begin measuring the force of what had happened. The research record is clear about the basic form of the device. The bomb was concealed in a Ryder rental truck. The Oklahoma Historical Society describes it as a 4,800-pound ammonium nitrate fuel oil bomb. Britannica describes the explosive charge as more than 2 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil concealed in a rental truck. The phrasing differs slightly across summaries, but the central fact is the same. The attack depended on a large vehicle bomb made from ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, placed close to the Murrah Building's north side. That material description is important, but it has to be handled carefully. It is not a technical curiosity. It is not an engineering puzzle separated from consequence. In the public history of the bombing, ammonium nitrate and fuel oil became part of the vocabulary of domestic terrorism because they showed how ordinary commercial materials could be turned toward mass murder. The Ryder truck made that transformation possible at scale. It gave the device mobility, concealment, and a place in plain sight. The truck's position also mattered. The confirmed accounts place it near the north entrance or north side of the Murrah Building. NIST later described the blast location in relation to the structure itself, estimating that it occurred approximately 4.9 meters, or 16 feet, from one of the north side columns. That kind of measurement may sound clinical, but in the aftermath, it became one of the keys to understanding the collapse. The truck was not simply outside the building. It was close enough to transfer extreme force directly into the building's structural system. Before the explosion, the Ryder truck was part of a familiar American landscape. Rental trucks moved through cities for ordinary reasons: deliveries, moves, maintenance, business. They were meant to be noticed only as background. That ordinariness was part of the attack's concealment. The vehicle did not have to defeat a battlefield perimeter. It had to sit long enough near a public federal building in downtown Oklahoma City on a weekday morning. The Murrah Building had already been introduced as a place of federal work, with regional offices connected to agencies including the Social Security Administration, the FBI, the Secret Service, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and a credit union. The truck's placement beside that building connected the weapon directly to the daily presence of federal authority. But the blast did not discriminate among agencies, occupations, or purposes for being there. The device was aimed at a building, yet its victims were people in offices, hallways, waiting areas, nearby streets, and neighboring structures. The size of the bomb helps explain why the damage reached far beyond the truck itself. The Oklahoma Historical Society's figure of approximately 4,800 pounds gives one way to grasp the mass involved. Britannica's description, more than 2 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil, gives another. NIST later estimated the yield at approximately 1.8 megagrams, or 4,000 pounds, of TNT equivalent. These numbers are not interchangeable measurements of the same thing in casual language. They describe mass, composition, and estimated explosive effect in different ways. Together, they show the scale of the force released on Northwest 5th Street. The truck was destroyed in the blast, but it was not erased from the investigation. That would become critical later. A rear axle from the Ryder truck helped investigators trace a vehicle identification number to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. In time, the truck would become more than the weapons container. It would become a trail: metal, records, rental paperwork, a vehicle history, a route back through ordinary systems of commerce. The same ordinariness that had helped conceal it before the attack became part of how investigators began reconstructing the crime afterward. But at this point in the story, before the case narrows toward names and arrests, the truck must first be understood as the physical center of the blast. Its placement near the north side shaped the pattern of destruction. The energy moved outward through air, glass, concrete, steel reinforcement, office interiors, parked vehicles, sidewalks, and neighboring buildings. The damage was not abstract. It had direction and geometry. It had a source point. The north side of the Murrah Building took the force first and most severely. This is why later structural findings depend so heavily on the truck's location. NIST's analysis of the building did not begin with a vague idea that an explosion occurred somewhere nearby. It considered where the blast originated, how close it was to key structural elements, and how the building responded. The distance from the truck to a north side column, the estimated yield, and the building's design all became part of a larger explanation for why the damage took the form it did. The distinction matters because the bombing was both an act of violence and an event in physical space. Public memory often holds the image of a building torn open, its rooms exposed, its north face devastated. But that image had a cause rooted in placement, mass, materials, and structural vulnerability. The Ryder truck was the delivery system that brought the explosive force to the curb. Its location translated intention into collapse. There is also a quieter point here about power and access. The Murrah Building was a federal building, but it sat in a city, on a street, among other buildings. It was not isolated from civilian life. Northwest 5th Street was not only an address line. It was a public approach to government offices, a place where employees arrived and visitors entered. The bomb exploited that openness. The rental truck used the normal circulation of a city against the people inside it. After the explosion, the truck existed in fragments, records, and forensic reconstruction. Investigators would later follow physical evidence from the vehicle toward Kansas. They would examine rental records and leads on a scale that became part of the OKBOMB investigation. But the first fact remained the simplest and most devastating. A Ryder truck had been parked near the north side of the Murrah Building, carrying a massive ammonium nitrate and fuel oil device, and at approximately 9:02 in the morning, it detonated. From there, the story moves into the building itself. The bomb's force did not merely shatter windows or damage a facade. It destroyed most of the north half of the Murrah Building's rectangular footprint and set off failures deep within the structure. To understand why the damage became so extensive, the truck's position has to be held together with the building's design. The north side columns, the third-floor transfer girder, and the chain of collapse that followed the first instant of the blast. From the Ryder truck, the story moves into concrete, columns, floor slabs, and load paths. The explosion did not strike an empty surface. It struck a working federal building, whose shape and structure determined how the first instant of violence became a much larger collapse. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, in its later examination of the Murrah Building, described the damage in structural terms. The blast destroyed most of the north half of the building's rectangular footprint. It caused roughly half of the usable space inside the building to collapse. Those words are technical, but they carry the scale of what happened. This was not limited facade damage. It was not a broken front wall with the rest of the building standing behind it. The north side was torn away, and the failure moved through the building's frame. The Murrah Building was a reinforced concrete ordinary frame. NIST reported that it had been designed under ACI 3 18-71, a concrete design standard of its era. That matters because the building was not designed to resist blast. It was not designed for earthquakes. It was not designed for other extreme loading conditions. In ordinary service, a structure like this is meant to carry its expected loads: floors, offices, people, equipment, walls, and the normal forces of daily use. Its design assumptions are the assumptions of a federal office building, not a battlefield, and not a deliberate attack by a large truck bomb at close range. The device, as NIST estimated it in blast terms, had a yield of approximately 1.8 megagrams, or about 4,000 pounds, of TNT equivalent. The truck was positioned close to the north side of the Murrah Building, and NIST placed the blast location at approximately 4.9 meters, or 16 feet, from one of the north side columns. That distance is essential to understanding the collapse. A blast loses force as it moves outward, but at that range, against critical supporting elements, the pressure was not an abstraction. It was a direct structural assault. Buildings stand because forces are carried in organized ways. Floors carry weight to beams or girders. Girders and slabs carry weight to columns. Columns carry weight down to the foundation. The system depends on continuity. When one element is damaged, other parts may sometimes redistribute the load. But redistribution has limits, especially when several critical elements are destroyed at once and the structure has not been detailed for extreme events. NIST identified 3 columns supporting a third-floor transfer girder as central to what followed. Those 3 columns were immediately destroyed. The transfer girder they supported was not a decorative part of the building. A transfer girder exists because loads from above need to be moved across a span and delivered into supports below. It is a structural bridge inside the building's skeleton. When the columns supporting that transfer girder were taken out, the upper stories lost part of the path by which their weight was carried downward. That is the point where the first damage became progressive collapse. Progressive collapse means that an initial local failure spreads. One part fails, then the loads that part had carried shift suddenly onto adjacent elements. If those nearby elements cannot carry the added demand, they fail too. The collapse then advances through the structure, not because every piece was struck directly by the original blast, but because the structure's own weight and disrupted load paths begin to pull it apart. In the Murrah Building, NIST reported that the immediate destruction of those 3 columns triggered the progressive collapse of the upper stories. The force of the bomb did not have to pulverize every floor by direct pressure. Once key supports were gone, gravity became part of the mechanism. The upper floors that had depended on those supports could not remain suspended. They came down, and as they came down, they imposed new impacts and loads on the floors and framing below. The visible result was the familiar and terrible wound in the building. The north half opened and collapsed, with the upper levels sheared away across a broad section. NIST described a damage width of 21.3 meters, or 70 feet, across the building. Within that width, the structural system had been overwhelmed. Concrete, reinforcing steel, floors, office spaces, and corridors were turned into layered debris. This is one reason the physical evidence mattered so much after the bombing. The pattern of collapse was not random. It reflected where the truck had been, where the blast entered the building, which columns were destroyed, and how the building carried its loads. The wreckage itself became a record of force and sequence. Investigators could look at the north side columns, the transfer girder, and the collapsed upper stories, and reconstruct how a truck bomb outside produced failure inside. That reconstruction also helped separate 2 different kinds of destruction that happened at nearly the same time. There was the blast wave, which shattered, struck, and displaced. And there was the collapse, which followed from the building's structural failure. For people inside, these were not experienced as separate events in any meaningful human sense. But for engineers, rescue planners, investigators, and later security officials, the distinction mattered. A building can be damaged by blast without collapsing. A building can lose some exterior surfaces and still remain standing. In Oklahoma City, the loss of critical supports produced something more, a chain reaction through the frame. The building's ordinary design was not a defect in the simple sense. It reflected what the structure had been expected to face when it was built and occupied. Federal office buildings were not universally designed to withstand a large vehicle bomb detonated at close range. NIST's point was not that the Murrah Building had been built for this and failed anyway. The point was that it had not been designed for blast, earthquakes, or comparable extreme loading conditions. Its reinforced concrete frame was ordinary. The event was not. That gap between ordinary design and extraordinary attack became one of the lasting lessons of the bombing. The Murrah Building had stood on Northwest 5th Street as part of a civic landscape. Offices, agencies, a credit union, public services, appointments, and daily federal work. The truck transformed that landscape by placing an immense explosive charge near critical structural members. In seconds, a normal building became a collapse site. The phrase "north half" can sound almost clinical, but it is important because it locates the destruction. The blast was on the north side. The north half of the rectangular footprint absorbed the direct structural consequence. Roughly half of the usable space collapsed. That means that offices, hallways, waiting rooms, work areas, and interior spaces were not only damaged, but physically lost into the debris field. The building's plan, which had organized government work across floors, became a map of voids. The third-floor transfer girder is another phrase that sounds technical until its role is understood. It was part of how the upper stories depended on the lower structure. When the three supporting columns were immediately destroyed, that dependency became fatal. The upper stories no longer had the necessary support in that region. They fell not as an isolated panel, but as part of a progressive failure tied to the building's own system of support. NIST's findings give the chapter a restrained clarity. They do not make the event less brutal. They make it more understandable. The destruction was the result of a massive ammonium nitrate and fuel oil device placed close to a building not designed for such an attack. The blast removed key columns. The loss of those columns undermined a transfer girder. The upper floors progressively collapsed. Most of the north half of the footprint was destroyed, and roughly half of the usable space came down. This is the physical explanation for the shape of the ruin that rescuers entered and survivors emerged from. It is also the bridge between the mechanics of the bomb and the human consequences of the morning. The collapse was measured in columns, meters, girders, and load paths. But inside those spaces were people at work, people waiting, people arriving, and children in the building's daily life. To understand the toll, the structure has to be seen not only as concrete that failed, but as occupied space that disappeared. The structure failed in measurable ways, but the loss cannot be understood through measurements alone. The north half of the Murrah Building was not just a section of reinforced concrete. It was occupied space. It held offices, counters, waiting areas, work routines, appointments, errands, and a daycare center inside the daily life of a federal building. When the collapse moved through those floors, it moved through lives already in motion. The central number is 168. That is the number repeated in federal summaries, historical accounts, and memorial language because it is the number that has to be held at the center of the story. 168 people died in the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995. Among them were 19 children. The children have never been a footnote to the event. Their deaths are part of what made the bombing feel, immediately and permanently, like an attack not only on a building or a government, but on an ordinary civic mourning. The Murrah Building was a place where federal work happened in public. People came there for the Social Security Administration. Agencies kept regional offices there, including the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. A credit union operated there. The building was not a military target. It was not a remote installation. It stood in downtown Oklahoma City, near Northwest 5th Street, integrated into the blocks around it. That meant the blast reached far beyond the people who worked inside. According to summaries from the FBI and Britannica, the attack injured more than 500 people. The Oklahoma Historical Society gives a higher approximate figure, about 850 injured. Those figures reflect different ways of counting harm in a mass casualty event. The people pulled from ruins, the people struck by debris, the people cut by flying glass, the people in nearby buildings, the people whose injuries may not have fit one simple category in the first hours. What they share is the scale. Hundreds of people were hurt in addition to the 168 killed. In the first minutes after the explosion, the boundary between victim and rescuer was not always fixed. Survivors emerged from smoke, dust, broken concrete, and exposed floors. People nearby moved toward the damage before the full danger could be understood. The physical collapse described by NIST created voids, unstable spaces, and wreckage that had to be searched. The building had become evidence, but before it could be evidence in a courtroom or a technical report, it was a field of rescue. The human toll also extended outward through the neighborhood. The Oklahoma Historical Society reports that property damage affected more than 300 buildings in a 48-square-block area. That figure matters because it shows the bombing as an urban disaster, not only a single building collapse. More than 300 buildings carried some mark of the blast. Windows broke. Walls were damaged. Structures were shaken. Businesses, offices, and public spaces around the Murrah Building were folded into the event by force. Across Northwest 5th Street, the National Park Service identifies the Athenian Office Building and the Oklahoma Water Resources Building as wrecked and eventually imploded. Those buildings were not incidental scenery. They were part of the district that absorbed the explosion. Their eventual removal shows how the damage continued after the morning itself. A bomb detonated in seconds, but the city lived with the structural consequences for months and years. The National Park Service says 16 buildings in total were taken down after the bombing. This wider damage helps explain why the casualty numbers were so high and why the trauma spread so quickly through Oklahoma City. The blast did not stay within the Murrah Building's footprint. It moved through air, glass, street corridors, parked vehicles, and neighboring structures. It struck people who had no connection to any federal agency. It reached people who happened to be downtown, people at work in nearby offices, people passing through the area, people close enough to be injured by the pressure wave and debris. Yet the center remained the Murrah Building itself. The earlier structural account explains how roughly half of the usable space collapsed and how most of the north half of the rectangular footprint was destroyed. But when those facts are translated into human terms, they mean that rooms vanished. Floors where people had been working or waiting fell into one another. Offices lost walls, ceilings, and access routes. The normal separations between floors collapsed into a single mass of wreckage. In a disaster like this, official numbers become necessary because they protect the record from vagueness. 168 dead, 19 children, more than 500 injured according to FBI and Britannica summaries. About 850 injured according to the Oklahoma Historical Society. More than 300 buildings damaged. A 48-square-block area affected point. 16 buildings taken down after the bombing. But numbers can also conceal the intimacy of loss if they are repeated too quickly. Each number is an index to separate lives. People with family members waiting for news, people whose names would later be spoken in memorial services, people whose absence rearranged homes, workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. The phrase 19 children is especially difficult because it compresses lives into a statistic. It is accurate, but it is not complete. The public record can tell us how many children were killed. It cannot fully hold what those 19 deaths meant to parents, siblings, grandparents, teachers, and rescue workers. The Oklahoma City National Memorial would later build remembrance into the physical ground of the site. It includes 168 empty chairs on the footprint of the Murrah Building. The National Park Service explains that the 9 horizontal rows of chairs represent the 9 floors of the federal building. 5 chairs are placed outside the main organizational pattern to honor the 5 people killed outside the Murrah Building. That design turns the number back toward individuals. A chair is a simple object. It suggests a person who should be present and is not. The memorial also includes the survivor wall, which contains names of survivors within a 2-block radius and incorporates 4 granite slabs salvaged from the Murrah Building. That detail is important because survival itself became part of the recorded history. The bombing is often summarized by its death toll, as it should be. 168 lives were taken. But the survivor record shows another layer. Hundreds of people carried the event forward in their bodies, memories, and daily lives. Some survived from inside the building. Others survived nearby. Some were injured. Others were spared physically, but remained within the radius of the attack. The wall and the chairs together mark a distinction the city had to learn to hold. There were those who were killed. There were those who survived. There were those who searched, treated, carried, identified, and mourned. There were people whose offices were gone, whose buildings were condemned, whose city blocks became restricted space, whose ordinary routes through downtown were transformed into a disaster perimeter. This is why the phrase human toll reaches beyond a final count. It includes the dead, but also the injured. It includes the children, but also the adults who are working, waiting, and passing through. It includes the surrounding buildings and the people inside them. It includes the rescue workers who entered unstable wreckage and the families who waited through uncertainty. It includes the city itself, because the blast damaged more than 300 buildings across 48 square blocks and changed the meaning of a downtown street corner. In the public record, the bombing would soon become an investigation, a prosecution, and a defining case of domestic terrorism. Evidence would be gathered. Leads would be followed. Suspects would be named. But in the first public hours, before the facts were clear, the scale of grief collided with the pressure to explain who had done it. The damage was visible. The dead and injured were real. The need for answers was immediate. And into that need, early suspicion began to move in the wrong direction. The need for answers was immediate, and in the first public hours after the bombing, that need moved faster than the evidence. Downtown Oklahoma City had been torn open. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was in ruins. Rescue workers were still searching the wreckage. Families were still trying to learn who had survived and who had not. Across the city, broken glass, damaged offices, and blocked streets made the scale of the attack visible far beyond the building itself. But while the physical scene demanded patience, the public conversation did not always wait. In the first wave of explanation, suspicion turned in the wrong direction. Britannica notes that immediate suspicion wrongly focused on Middle Eastern terrorist groups before attention shifted to Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. The Oklahoma Historical Society describes the consequence more sharply. Early media accusations against Islamic terrorists contributed to 2 days of anti-Muslim hysteria. That wrong first suspicion is part of the history of the bombing, not because it identified the perpetrators, but because it shows what can happen in the gap between catastrophe and evidence. The attack was real. The dead and injured were real. The fear was real. But the first explanation that reached many people was not true. This was the atmosphere in which the bombing first entered public consciousness. It was not yet the settled case later associated with domestic terrorism, anti-government extremism, Timothy McVeigh, Terry Nichols, the Ryder truck, Junction City, and the federal investigation known as OKBOMB. It was a shattered federal building in Oklahoma City, a mass casualty attack in the middle of a workday, and a nation trying to interpret images of destruction before investigators had established the route from the bomb to the people responsible for it. The error mattered because suspicion is never only private. Once it is repeated publicly, it can shape behavior. It can turn grief outward. It can attach blame to people who had nothing to do with the crime. According to the Oklahoma Historical Society, the early accusations against Islamic terrorists helped create 2 days of anti-Muslim hysteria. In that phrase, the public record preserves a second kind of harm from the immediate aftermath, not the blast itself, but the social panic that followed a false assumption. The bombing had occurred on April 19, 1995. In the history that would later be written, the date would become tied to the rise of domestic terrorism in the United States. But in the first hours, the meaning of the attack was unsettled. The visible target was a federal building. The method was a truck bomb. The scale was immense. Those facts were enough to create speculation, but not enough to identify a perpetrator. That distinction is crucial. A visible pattern can suggest possibilities, but it is not evidence. A public fear can feel convincing, but it is not proof. The destroyed north side of the Murrah Building, the injured carried from nearby streets, the damage across downtown Oklahoma City, and the shock of 168 deaths did not, by themselves, reveal who had planned the attack. The answer would have to be built from physical evidence, witness accounts, records, and investigative labor. In the earliest public narrative, that discipline had not yet caught up with the demand for certainty. There is a reason this part of the story feels uneasy. The bombing itself was an act of political violence. It targeted a federal building and killed civilians, including 19 children. Yet the first wave of suspicion, as recorded by Britannica, looked outward toward Middle Eastern terrorist groups. That mistake reflected a readiness to fit the event into a familiar category before the facts had been assembled. It also delayed, at least in public understanding, recognition that the attack had grown from within the United States. The later shift in attention toward Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols would change the frame of the crime. Both men would become central names in the investigation and prosecution. McVeigh would be identified as the man who devised the plot and planted the bomb, according to the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General. Nichols would be indicted for crimes relating to the bombing. But those conclusions belonged to the developing case, not to the first confused public hours. In those first hours, the country was watching rescue and speculation happen at the same time. The contrast is important. Rescue work required direct contact with the evidence of human loss. It required entering unstable spaces, removing debris, finding survivors, recovering the dead, and protecting people from additional danger. Public speculation required none of that discipline. It could travel through broadcast reports and conversation before investigators had traced a truck axle, checked rental records, or connected a suspect sketch to a name. That is why the wrong first suspicion deserves its own place in the episode. It is not a side note. It is a warning about how quickly power can attach to an unverified story, especially when the story offers a simple answer to a terrifying event. For Muslim communities, the false public accusation did not remain abstract. The Oklahoma Historical Society's account of anti-Muslim hysteria points to a broader atmosphere of suspicion and hostility. People who had no connection to the attack were pulled into the emotional field created by it. The bombing had already devastated Oklahoma City. The misdirected blame widened the circle of fear. And at the same time, the real evidence was beginning to lead somewhere else. The actual investigation would not be built on an ethnic assumption or a regional stereotype. It would be built on fragments, records, interviews, and the slow reconstruction of movement and intent. It would become the FBI investigation known as OKBOMB. Investigators would conduct more than 28,000 interviews and follow more than 43,000 leads. They would collect more than 3 tons of evidence. They would search more than 13.2 million hotel registration records, review more than 3.1 million truck rental records, and search more than 682,000 airline reservation records. Those figures show the scale of the work required to replace speculation with proof. The path toward McVeigh and Nichols would come through evidence connected to the Ryder truck and the people who moved around it. A rear axle would help investigators trace a vehicle identification number to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. A sketch of the rental truck suspect would help lead investigators toward Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh himself had been arrested shortly after the bombing on a traffic-related stop before he was publicly known as the bombing suspect. Federal authorities would arrest him on April 21, 1995, only hours before he was expected to make bail on a state firearms charge. None of that was available as a completed public story in the first moments after the blast. It had to be discovered. The wrong suspicion, then, sits at the boundary between emotion and evidence. On one side were fear, anger, and the pressure to name an enemy. On the other side was the hard work of investigation, collecting debris, checking records, interviewing witnesses, and testing every lead against facts. The bombing's place in American history depends on understanding both sides. It was not only a mass killing. It was also a case in which the country first looked in the wrong direction before being forced by evidence to confront domestic anti-government violence. That confrontation would become central to the meaning of Oklahoma City. The perpetrators were not foreign agents from the early public imagination. The case that emerged involved former United States Army soldiers, anti-government grievance, and a bomb made from ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil, placed in a rented truck outside a federal building in the center of an American city. In the end, the first suspicion did not solve the crime. It revealed the danger of trying to solve a crime through fear. The record moved on because investigators moved differently. They did not have the luxury of assumption. They had to give names to evidence, locations to movements, and sequence to decisions. Out of the wreckage, the largest questions became practical ones. Where did the truck come from? Who rented it? What physical parts survived the blast? Who had been seen with it? Which records could place a person in the right place at the right time? That is where the public fog began to clear. Not all at once, and not because speculation corrected itself, but because the investigation expanded into a vast, methodical search. The false story of outside blame would recede as the evidence gathered weight. The name OKBOMB would come to stand for that effort. The interviews, the leads, the records, the fragments, and the long movement from a ruined building toward a prosecutable case. The false story began to lose force, not because the public mood corrected itself, but because evidence had to be handled in a different way. Rumor could move in broad strokes. An investigation could not. It had to start with what remained: metal, paper, witness memory, rental records, hotel ledgers, reservation systems, fragments of a truck, fragments of a building, and thousands of people who might have seen one useful detail without knowing its importance. The FBI investigation was given the name OKBOMB. The name was short, procedural, almost cold beside the human scale of what had happened at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. But that was part of its function. It converted a national trauma into an organized case file. It gave investigators a way to classify the work, root the evidence, record the leads, and keep one enormous inquiry from dissolving into noise. By the FBI's own summary, the scale of OKBOMB was extraordinary. Investigators conducted more than 28,000 interviews. They followed more than 43,000 leads. They collected more than 3 tons of evidence. They searched more than 13.2 million hotel registration records. They reviewed more than 3.1 million truck rental records. They searched more than 682,000 airline reservation records. Those figures are easy to hear as statistics, but each one describes a different kind of labor. An interview meant a person sitting across from investigators and trying to remember. It could mean a worker near downtown Oklahoma City, describing what they saw before the blast. It could mean someone at a motel, a rental counter, a gas station, a body shop, or an office trying to place a face, a vehicle, a receipt, a time. Memory after violence is imperfect, and investigators had to sort what was specific from what was only fearful. But the repetition mattered. Across thousands of interviews, details could begin to overlap. One person's partial recollection could become meaningful only when placed beside another person's record or another witness's description. A lead meant something that had to be tested. Some leads would have gone nowhere. Some would have reflected the same early confusion that had driven public suspicion in the wrong direction. Others would have been small and concrete: a vehicle, a rental transaction, a place where someone had stayed, a name on a form, a possible sighting. The point of following more than 43,000 leads was not that each one was equally strong. It was that the case could not depend on instinct. It had to narrow from abundance to proof. The physical evidence was another problem of scale. More than 3 tons of evidence were collected. That evidence came from an attack in which the bomb itself had destroyed much of the immediate scene. The Murrah Building had partly collapsed. Nearby buildings had been damaged across the surrounding area. The blast had scattered material outward, mixed building debris with vehicle fragments, and turned ordinary objects into possible evidence. Investigators were not simply looking for what was intact. They were looking for the meaning of broken things. This was why the work had to be both massive and exact. A truck bomb leaves traces differently than a weapon recovered whole. A rental truck used to conceal an ammonium nitrate and fuel oil device could be torn apart by the explosion, but not erased completely. Somewhere among the fragments could be metal that still carried identifying marks. Somewhere among the paperwork could be the transaction that connected a vehicle to a place to a person, and a person to a timeline. The record searches show how wide the investigation became. More than 13.2 million hotel registration records were searched. That number suggests investigators were not only looking at Oklahoma City, they were reconstructing movement. A bombing like this required preparation, travel, lodging, rental arrangements, and contacts across locations. Hotel records could show who was present in a city or near a route at a particular time. A name might be false, but a pattern could still matter. A date, a location, or a vehicle description could become a point of comparison. The review of more than 3.1 million truck rental records was even closer to the center of the case. The bomb had been concealed and transported in a rented Ryder truck, parked near the north side of the Murrah Building. That fact turned the rental system itself into an investigative field. It was not enough to know that a Ryder truck had been used. Investigators had to determine which truck, from which location, rented by whom, under what name, and through what sequence of records. The rental paperwork became a kind of map. It could lead backward from the destroyed vehicle to the counter where it had been rented, and from there to a witness, a description, or another document. The search of more than 682,000 airline reservation records shows another layer of the same method. Investigators had to test movement by multiple means. If a suspect had traveled by air, if a name appeared in a reservation system, if a route aligned with other records, that could matter. If no match appeared, that also shaped the investigation. In a case this large, absence could be informative only after a search was broad enough to make it meaningful. OKBOMB therefore became a contest against scale. The bombing had created destruction in a few seconds. The investigation had to reverse that violence through patient accumulation. It had to move from the collapsed building to the parts of the truck, from the truck to rental records, from records to witnesses, from witnesses to sketches, and from sketches to names. It had to hold grief and procedure in the same frame without letting either one replace the other. This is also where the distinction between public suspicion and investigative work becomes clearest. The early accusations against Islamic terrorists, described by the Oklahoma Historical Society as contributing to 2 days of anti-Muslim hysteria, had depended on a story imposed before evidence could support it. OKBOMB moved in the opposite direction. It did not begin with the answer. It began with what could be verified. That difference mattered not only for accuracy, but for power. A domestic terror case could not be understood if investigators looked only outward, toward foreign enemies imagined in the first hours. The evidence had to be allowed to point where it pointed. In that sense, OKBOMB was not only a search for perpetrators. It was a correction to the first national reflex. The case would come to focus on Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, both former United States Army soldiers, rather than the foreign groups first suspected in public discussion. But that shift did not happen by proclamation. It happened through fragments, records, interviews, and a disciplined narrowing of possibility. The most important early questions remained practical. Where had the Ryder truck come from? Which rental agency had handled it? Did any surviving part of the vehicle carry identifying information? Could a vehicle identification number still be found? Could the trail be followed from the blast scene back to a business, a counter, a person who remembered the rental? The answers began not with a confession or a dramatic public revelation, but with wreckage. Among the debris, investigators found a path back to the truck itself. A rear axle from the Ryder truck helped them trace a vehicle identification number to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. From that mechanical remnant, the enormous investigation began to tighten. The numbers of OKBOMB remained vast, but the case was starting to acquire direction, from downtown Oklahoma City through the remains of a rented truck toward Kansas and toward the first image of the man who had rented it. From the wreckage, the investigation began to narrow. The scale of OKBOMB remained enormous, with interviews, leads, records, and evidence moving through federal channels, but one fragment gave that work a sharper direction. It was not a full vehicle. It was not a clean document. It was a rear axle, torn from the Ryder truck that had carried the bomb to the north side of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. That rear axle mattered because vehicles carry identities in metal. Even when a truck is destroyed, investigators can sometimes work backward from surviving parts. A vehicle identification number can connect a fragment to a truck to a rental fleet, and a rental fleet to a specific business. In this case, the rear axle helped investigators trace a vehicle identification number to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. The path from Oklahoma City to Junction City was not symbolic. It was practical. It gave investigators a place to go, a set of records to examine, and people to question. Until then, the rented Ryder truck was a known object in the bombing, but an object without a complete, visible history. Witnesses had seen a truck. The blast scene had produced fragments. The evidence suggested the bomb had been concealed and transported in that vehicle. But to turn that knowledge into an investigative trail, federal agents needed to know which truck it had been, where it had been rented, and who had taken possession of it. The rear axle opened that route. Junction City, Kansas now became more than a point on a map. It became a place where the investigation could leave the crater and enter the world of ordinary transactions. A counter, a rental agreement, business records, signatures, recollections, and employee memory. The violence in Oklahoma City had been vast, but its preparation had required ordinary steps. A truck had to be obtained. A name had to be given. A person had to appear in front of someone else and complete the rental process. Investigators were looking for those ordinary moments because they could survive where the truck itself had not. This was one of the central patterns of the case. The bomb was catastrophic, but the evidence trail was built from small survivals. A mechanical part survived. A number survived. A business connection survived. A witness memory survived. Each piece did not explain the whole crime by itself, but together they began to turn an unknown bomber into a traceable person. The FBI later summarized this breakthrough in direct terms. A sketch of the rental truck suspect led investigators toward Timothy McVeigh. That sentence is brief, but it contains a crucial movement in the investigation. The axle and the vehicle identification number pointed investigators toward Junction City. The body shop and rental trail placed attention on the transaction. Then the human face entered the case. A sketch is not proof by itself. It is a working image, shaped from memory, imperfect by nature, useful because it gives investigators a way to compare one account with another. In a case filled with records, debris, and technical analysis, the sketch represented something different, the attempt to recover the appearance of the person who had stood at the rental counter. The investigation needed documents, but it also needed recognition. It needed someone to say, in effect, "This is the man I remember." The suspect linked to the rental truck was not yet a public certainty in those first movements from wreckage to Kansas. The investigation was still assembling its case. But the direction had changed. The false early suspicions that had moved through public discussion were being displaced by a specific trail grounded in evidence. The Ryder truck was no longer only the vehicle seen near the Murrah Building. It was now a vehicle with a recoverable identity. The recovered identity led to Junction City. The rental history led toward a person. The sketch gave that person a face. This was the kind of breakthrough that can appear simple after the fact. A part is found. A number is traced. A business is located. A witness helps produce a sketch. A suspect emerges. But in real time, each step depended on the careful handling of fragments that could easily have been missed, damaged, or misread. The blast had torn through concrete, glass, offices, and vehicles. Evidence was scattered through a wide field of destruction. The investigation had to distinguish what belonged to the Ryder truck from what belonged to the city around it. It had to connect a piece of metal found after the explosion to a specific commercial vehicle. It had to make that connection solid enough to guide agents outward from Oklahoma City. And once the trail reached Kansas, it placed the case within a geography that would keep reappearing. Kansas was not incidental to the story. The National Park Service places Fort Riley, Kansas, within the broader geography of the Oklahoma City bombing narrative as the place where Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols met while entering the Army. Junction City, near Fort Riley, now entered the investigative record through the Ryder truck trace. Harrington, Kansas, would soon become important when Terry Lynn Nichols surrendered after learning he was being sought by the FBI. The investigation was moving through places where military service, personal association, and later suspicion intersected. For investigators, the immediate question was narrower: who rented the truck? The answer began to point toward Timothy McVeigh. The FBI states that the sketch of the rental truck suspect led investigators toward him. That did not make the case complete. It did not yet explain the full conspiracy, the materials, the preparation, or the roles of others. But it gave OKBOMB something every large investigation needs: a central figure to test against the evidence. Names could now be compared with records, movements could be checked against dates, witness accounts could be placed beside documents. The huge search through truck rental records, hotel registration records, airline reservations, interviews, and leads could begin to organize around a person rather than only around an event. There is a quiet significance in how this happened. The investigation did not solve the bombing through a single revelation at the scene. It moved from destruction to administration, from twisted metal to a vehicle identification number, from a number to a business, from a business to a remembered face. That movement was slow enough to be methodical and fast enough to matter. The bombing had occurred on April 19, 1995. Within days, federal authorities would identify Timothy McVeigh as a suspect. But the path there passed through the kind of evidence that does not speak in dramatic language. It had to be read. The rear axle was part of a truck. The truck was part of a rental fleet. The rental was part of a paper trail. The paper trail was connected to a person. In a true crime narrative, that sequence can sound almost inevitable. In an archive report, it looks more fragile. It required that a vehicle part survive. It required that identifying information remain usable. It required that investigators trace it correctly. It required that people in Junction City provide usable memory and records. It required that a sketch become a tool rather than a conclusion. The importance of the sketch also lay in what it replaced. In the first public hours, suspicion had moved in the wrong direction, shaped by fear and assumption rather than proof. The rental truck Sarda sketch was different. It came out of an evidentiary chain. It did not begin with a theory about foreign enemies. It began with the object used in the bombing and followed that object backward. The investigation was still under pressure, but this was a pressure being answered with procedure. By the time the trail pointed toward Timothy McVeigh, another crucial fact was already in motion, though its full importance had not yet been publicly understood. McVeigh had been arrested shortly after the bombing on a traffic-related stop before he was identified as the bombing suspect. That timing would become one of the most consequential facts in the early case. While investigators were tracing metal from Oklahoma City to Junction City, and while the sketch was carrying them toward a name, the man they were moving toward was already in custody on another matter. The Axle Trail had done its work. It had taken investigators from the ruined north side of the Murrah Building to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas, and from there toward the face of the rental truck suspect. The case was beginning to tighten around Timothy McVeigh. But the next urgent question was not only who he was. It was where he was, how he had already been stopped, and how close federal authorities came to losing him before they knew what they had. The Axle Trail had narrowed the investigation, but it also revealed a strange and urgent fact. The man investigators were moving toward was not hiding in some distant place. Timothy McVeigh had already been stopped. Before the sketch had fully done its work, before the public understood his name, before federal authorities had formally identified him as the bombing suspect, McVeigh was in custody on another matter. That timing is one of the most important turns in the early Oklahoma City case. In the first hours after the bombing, investigators were still working outward from wreckage. They had the ruined Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. They had fragments of the Ryder truck. They had the rear axle that helped trace a vehicle identification number to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. They had witnesses and records that began to point toward the rental truck suspect. But the suspect himself had already crossed into another part of the legal system, not as the named target of OKBOMB, but as a man arrested after a traffic-related stop. McVeigh was arrested shortly after the bombing, before he was identified as the bombing suspect. The charge holding him was not yet the federal case that would come to define him. It was a state firearms charge. For a brief period, the person who would become the central defendant in the bombing case existed in custody under a far narrower label. That gap between what had happened in Oklahoma City and what authorities yet knew about McVeigh is difficult to overstate. The bombing had killed 168 people, including 19 children. It had injured hundreds more. It had damaged a broad area of the city and brought federal, state, and local responders into a scene of mass death and structural collapse. Yet the investigation still had to move through evidence, records, identification, and procedure. A case this large could not simply leap from destruction to arrest. It had to prove its way from one point to the next. The traffic-related stop placed McVeigh inside that narrow window. In one sense, it was an ordinary law enforcement encounter, separate from the enormous federal investigation taking shape. In another, it became a point on which the early case could have turned. McVeigh was not yet being held because investigators had named him as the bombing suspect. He was being held because of the state firearms matter. That meant the clock was running in more than one jurisdiction at once. While federal investigators followed the Ryder truck evidence back to Kansas, McVeigh was moving through state custody. While the sketch of the rental truck suspect helped lead investigators toward his name, the legal basis keeping him in custody remained limited. The question was no longer only whether investigators could identify the man in the sketch. It was whether they could connect that identity to the person already in jail before he was released. The date that mattered was April 21st, 1995. Federal authorities arrested Timothy McVeigh that day, hours before he was expected to make bail on the state firearms charge. The phrasing is plain, but the consequence is enormous. Hours before, not days. Not after a long period of surveillance. Not after a slow and controlled transfer from one established case to another. Federal authorities acted within a narrowing margin, at the moment when the custody that had been holding him might soon have ended. This is why the arrest timing occupies such a central place in the early story. Investigators had not captured McVeigh after a national manhunt in the way the public might later imagine. He had already been arrested. The man the evidence was beginning to identify had been held under a state charge, and federal authorities had to move before that state process opened the door for his release. The arrest also shows the difference between suspicion and a prosecutable case. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, public suspicion had already moved in damaging and inaccurate directions. Earlier accusations had wrongly focused on Middle Eastern terrorist groups, contributing, as the Oklahoma Historical Society states, to 2 days of anti-Muslim hysteria. But federal investigators could not build their case on public fear. They had to build it on the kind of evidence that could be carried into court: the truck fragment, the vehicle identification number, rental records, witness descriptions, names, dates, and links between places. That is what made the sequence so tense. The investigation was expanding on a national scale under the name OKBOMB, with thousands of interviews, tens of thousands of leads, and millions of records searched. But at the same time, one individual case in state custody had become urgent. If McVeigh made bail before federal authorities acted, the investigation would have entered a far more uncertain phase. By April 21st, the federal case had reached him. The arrest by federal authorities did not end the investigation. It changed its center of gravity. Until then, the evidence trail had been moving from the blast site to the truck, from the truck to Junction City, Kansas, and from the rental trail toward the man connected to it. Once McVeigh was in federal custody, the case could begin to look outward from him as well as inward toward him. Who had he known? Where had he been? What records placed him near the truck, near Kansas, near Oklahoma City? What other names belong to the wider story? The significance of McVeigh's custody also lies in what it reveals about domestic terrorism investigations. A major attack may begin with a spectacular act of violence, but the response often turns on smaller procedural facts: a traffic stop, a state charge, a bail schedule, a courthouse process, a transfer of authority. These are not dramatic details in the usual sense. They are administrative and legal details. But here, they mattered as much as any single breakthrough in the evidence trail. The bombing itself was an act aimed at federal power, carried out at a federal office building that housed agencies and workers connected to the everyday machinery of government. The early investigation, in turn, depended on government systems functioning under pressure: crime scene recovery, evidence tracking, vehicle records, witness interviews, state custody, federal arrest authority, and the coordination needed to move quickly before a suspect was released. McVeigh's arrest on April 21st therefore sits between two parts of the story. Behind it was the physical investigation: the Murrah Building, the Ryder truck, the rear axle, Junction City, and the sketch. Ahead of it was the widening legal and investigative case: other people, other locations, other decisions, and the gradual construction of federal charges. At the moment federal authorities took him into custody, McVeigh was no longer only the man who had been stopped shortly after the bombing. He had become the central figure in the federal investigation, but the case did not stop with his name. It continued outward, toward Kansas again, toward Harrington, and toward Terry Lynn Nichols, who would surrender after learning he was being sought by the FBI. From there, the question would widen from McVeigh's arrest to the larger structure of responsibility around the bombing. After McVeigh was taken into federal custody, the investigation did not become smaller. It became more precise. The name Timothy McVeigh gave the case a central figure, but it also forced investigators to ask what stood around him: who knew him, who had traveled with him, who had shared his views, who had helped him acquire materials, and who might have understood what the Ryder truck was going to become. That line of inquiry led back into Kansas. Terry Lynn Nichols was not introduced to the case as a public symbol in the same way McVeigh was. His name emerged through the widening structure of OKBOMB, through the painstaking work of connecting people, places, records, and movements. Nichols was a former United States Army soldier, like McVeigh. The National Park Service places their shared military geography at Fort Riley, Kansas, where McVeigh and Nichols met while entering the Army. By the time investigators were looking for Nichols after the bombing, Kansas had already become central to the case. Junction City was tied to the Ryder truck trace, and Harrington would become tied to Nichols himself. Nichols surrendered in Harrington, Kansas, after learning he was being sought by the FBI. That surrender mattered because it showed the case had moved beyond the first dramatic arrest. McVeigh had been stopped shortly after the bombing on a traffic-related matter and then taken into federal custody on April 21, 1995, hours before he was expected to make bail on a state firearms charge. Nichols came into the case differently. He was not the man pulled over on the road immediately after the explosion. He was the man whose connection to McVeigh drew federal attention as investigators reconstructed the broader path to the bombing. In a case of this scale, a surrender was not the end of uncertainty. It was the beginning of another kind of work. Investigators had to determine not only whether Nichols knew McVeigh, but what that knowledge meant. Friendship, ideology, past military service, or proximity were not enough by themselves. Federal prosecutors needed evidence that could be organized into charges. The government had to build a case that could survive court, with claims specific enough to be tested and records strong enough to be presented under the rules of a criminal trial. This is where the story begins to shift from the immediate mechanics of investigation to the architecture of federal prosecution. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General later summarized the division of responsibility in a careful way. It states that McVeigh devised the plot and planted the bomb. Nichols and Michael Fortier were indicted for crimes relating to the bombing. Fortier pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement. Those lines are spare, but they mark an important boundary. The federal case did not describe every person in the same role. McVeigh was identified as the person who devised the plot and planted the bomb. Nichols was charged in relation to the bombing, and so was Fortier. Fortier's guilty plea, entered as part of a plea agreement, placed him in a different posture from those who went to federal trial. This distinction matters because public memory often compresses major crimes into a single name. In Oklahoma City, that name became Timothy McVeigh. But the legal record widened the frame. It asked how one man's plan was discussed, supported, known, concealed, or enabled by others. It asked what responsibility looked like around the central act. It did not have to make every defendant identical in order to treat the case as larger than one arrest. Nichols's surrender also changed the public shape of the investigation. The case had already passed through a series of narrowing turns: the blast site, the Ryder truck, the rear axle, the vehicle identification number, the body shop in Junction City, the sketch, and McVeigh's arrest. Each step had made the investigation feel more directed, but Nichols brought a different kind of widening. The question was no longer only how investigators found the truck or identified the man who rented it. It was how the alleged conspiracy had formed, how long it had taken shape, and how many people had crossed into criminal responsibility. The federal process moved toward indictment. On August 10, 1995, a federal grand jury in Oklahoma City indicted McVeigh and Nichols. That date placed the investigation inside a formal legal frame. Before indictment, the case had been driven by emergency response, evidence recovery, witness interviews, record searches, and urgent arrests. After indictment, the government's claims had to be written as charges. The enormity of the bombing had to be translated into the language of counts, defendants, proof, and jurisdiction. That translation could never capture the full human loss. 168 people had been killed. 19 of them were children. Hundreds more had been injured. The Murrah Building had not simply been damaged. Much of its north half had been destroyed, and the collapse had reshaped downtown Oklahoma City. But a criminal case has its own demands. It does not replace grief with procedure. It creates a path by which the state can assign responsibility under law. Nichols's presence in that process made the prosecution more complex. McVeigh's arrest had been urgent because he was close to release on another charge before federal authorities intervened. Nichols's surrender created a different investigative challenge to determine what could be proven about conduct before the morning of April 19th. The government had to connect timelines, relationships, materials, and intentions. It had to separate suspicion from evidence. Michael Fortier's role added another layer. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General notes that Fortier was indicted for crimes relating to the bombing and that he pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement. A plea agreement is not simply a footnote. It can alter the shape of a prosecution. It can mark an acknowledgement of criminal responsibility while also becoming part of the government's broader case. In a crime built from planning and association, the difference between going to trial and pleading guilty can matter deeply. By the late summer of 1995, The investigation had therefore become both narrower and wider at the same time. Narrower, because federal authorities had identified and charged central figures. Wider, because the case now reached beyond the man in custody after the traffic stop. It extended into Kansas, into earlier relationships, into the question of who participated and how, and into the broader anti-government world from which the attack had emerged. The formal case against Nichols did not end with his surrender. It would move through indictment, a change of venue, and trial. But at this stage, his surrender in Harrington marked a turning point. The bombing was no longer only a scene of destruction or a hunt for a suspect. It had become a federal conspiracy case, shaped by evidence and by competing levels of culpability. And behind that legal widening was a deeper question still waiting to be faced. What had carried these men toward the idea that a federal building, filled with office workers, visitors, and children, could be treated as a target? The names now before investigators pointed outward beyond Oklahoma City, toward Fort Riley, Waco, Ruby Ridge, and the landscape of anti-government rage that had been building long before the Ryder truck reached Northwest 5th Street. The widening of the case led back into a different kind of map. It was not the map drawn by blast debris, hotel records, truck rentals, or airline reservations. It was a map of places where grievance hardened into ideology, where personal histories crossed institutional histories, and where anti-government anger became part of the documented background of the Oklahoma City bombing. By the time investigators were looking at Timothy McVeigh, Terry Lynn Nichols, and Michael Fortier, the question was no longer only how the Ryder truck reached Northwest 5th Street. It was how the idea of attacking a federal building had become thinkable to the man who, according to the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General, devised the plot and planted the bomb. The sources do not require speculation to see the outline. The FBI says McVeigh's hatred of the federal government intensified after the Waco standoff in 1993. That standoff ended with 76 people dead. The FBI also says McVeigh went to Waco during the standoff and distributed anti-government literature there. Those details matter because they place McVeigh not at a distance from the anti-government world of the early 1990s, but inside its orbit. Waco was not just a news event he watched from afar. According to the FBI's account, he traveled there while the standoff was still unfolding. He brought literature. He presented himself in the language of opposition to the federal government. And after Waco, the FBI says that hatred intensified. This does not make Waco the whole explanation for Oklahoma City. No single place can explain the deaths of 168 people at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. But in the documented record, Waco becomes one of the points where McVeigh's grievance against the federal government sharpened. It becomes part of the route by which political rage moved from belief into action. The National Park Service places the broader geography of this story across Pendleton, New York, Decker, Michigan, Fort Riley, Kansas, Waco, Texas, Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and Oklahoma City. That list reads almost like a series of coordinates. Each name carries a different part of the history. Pendleton is associated with Timothy McVeigh's origins. Decker is associated with Terry Nichols's origins. Fort Riley is where the National Park Service says McVeigh and Nichols met while entering the Army. Waco and Ruby Ridge are identified as central places in the anti-government grievance context. Oklahoma City is where that context ended in mass death. The geography is important because it resists the idea that the bombing came from nowhere. The attack was sudden, but the anger behind it was not. It moved through communities, military connections, public confrontations, and extremist interpretations of federal power. It drew meaning from places that had become symbols inside anti-government circles. In that world, Waco and Ruby Ridge were not only locations, they were treated as evidence in a larger accusation against the government. For McVeigh, the FBI's description is direct. His hatred of the federal government intensified after Waco. He went there. He distributed anti-government literature. These are not minor background details. They show a man placing himself near a confrontation between federal authorities and civilians, then carrying away from it an even stronger animus toward the state. In the later investigation, that animus helped explain why a federal building was chosen as the target. The Murrah Building was not an abstract symbol to the people inside it. It was a workplace. It held regional offices and ordinary daily business. People came there for federal services, appointments, records, and jobs. Children were inside because the building held a daycare center. But to the bomber, the building could be reduced to what it represented: the federal government. That reduction is one of the most chilling features of political violence. It strips away the human reality of a place and replaces it with an emblem. The earlier chapters traced how investigators moved from wreckage to evidence, from a rear axle to Junction City, from a sketch to McVeigh, from McVeigh to Nichols, and from Nichols to a broader conspiracy case. This chapter looks at the parallel movement beneath those facts, the movement from grievance to target selection. It asks why the north side of a federal building in Oklahoma City became, in the mind of the attacker, a place to park a truck filled with explosives. The answer in the record begins with anti-government rage. It does not end there, but it begins there. The FBI's account of McVeigh after Waco offers one clear line: a hatred that intensified after 76 deaths in Texas. The National Park Service's broader map shows that Oklahoma City belonged to a wider landscape of associations: Pendleton, Decker, Fort Riley, Waco, Ruby Ridge, and Oklahoma City. In that sequence, personal background and political grievance met. Fort Riley is especially important because it ties the later case back to a shared military connection. The National Park Service says McVeigh and Nichols met there while entering the Army. That relationship, already followed through the widening investigation, did not appear only after the bombing. It had roots in an earlier institutional setting, before the Ryder truck, before the Kansas Trail, before Harrington, and before the federal indictment. Fort Riley becomes one of the places where the human network behind the case first formed. Pendleton and Decker matter in a quieter way. They remind us that the men who became central figures in the case came from actual towns, actual families, and actual biographies. Domestic terrorism does not arrive only from distant battlefields or foreign organizations. In this case, it emerged from within the United States, from people with American hometowns, military experience, and an ideology that turned against the federal government itself. That fact is part of what made the Oklahoma City bombing such a defining case. In the immediate aftermath, public suspicion had wrongly turned toward Middle Eastern terrorist groups, and earlier chapters traced how that suspicion contributed to anti-Muslim hysteria before the investigation shifted toward McVeigh and Nichols. The evidence then forced a different recognition. The mass killing had come from domestic anti-government extremism. The shift was not merely investigative. It was national. The country had to look at the possibility that the threat was not only external, not only foreign, not only somewhere beyond the border. It could be internal. It could speak the language of American grievance. It could wrap itself in claims about federal tyranny. It could choose a federal building in the middle of an American city and call that choice political. The sources preserve this without needing to dramatize it. McVeigh's hatred intensified after Waco. He went to Waco and distributed anti-government literature. The National Park Service places Waco and Ruby Ridge inside the broader geography of the story, alongside the origins of McVeigh and Nichols, their meeting at Fort Riley, and the final attack in Oklahoma City. Those facts are enough to show the ideological terrain. They also help explain why the prosecution that followed would need to do more than prove identity. It would need to show planning, conspiracy, responsibility, and intent. The government would have to move from investigation to formal charges, from evidence gathered under the name OKBOMB to an indictment capable of being tested in court. The map of rage had brought investigators to the background of the crime. The legal map was about to take shape in Oklahoma City and then move west to Denver. The legal map began where the destruction had occurred, Oklahoma City. After the investigation had moved through debris, rental records, Kansas leads, arrests, surrender, and the documented background of anti-government rage, the federal case had to take a different form. Evidence gathered under the name OKBOMB could identify suspects and reconstruct a path. But prosecution required something more formal. It required charges placed before a court, written in the language of federal law. On August 10, 1995, a federal grand jury in Oklahoma City indicted Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. That date marked a turn in the public shape of the case. Until then, the story had been carried by the immediacy of the bombing, the speed of the investigation, and the widening circle around McVeigh, Nichols, and others connected to them. The FBI's work had been immense, interviews, leads, hotel records, truck rental records, airline reservation records, and physical evidence. But an indictment is not a search. It is not a sketch, a lead, or a recovered axle. It is the government's formal accusation. The grand jury sat in the same city where the attack had killed 168 people, including 19 children. It was the city where the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building had stood, where nearby buildings across Northwest 5th Street had been damaged or wrecked, and where the physical absence of the north half of the structure had become part of daily life. By August, Oklahoma City was not only the scene of the crime, it was also the first legal setting for the federal case. That mattered because the bombing was both local and national. It had destroyed a federal building, killed federal employees and civilians, and injured hundreds. It had also damaged more than 300 buildings across a 48-square-block area, according to the Oklahoma Historical Society. The case belonged to federal prosecutors, but it also belonged, in the most immediate human sense, to the people of Oklahoma City. The indictment brought those two realities together: federal authority and local grief. McVeigh and Nichols were not being placed into the story as abstractions. By this point, investigators had already traced the Ryder truck through physical evidence, including a rear axle that helped lead to a vehicle identification number, and then to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. They had followed the sketch of the rental truck suspect toward McVeigh. McVeigh had been arrested shortly after the bombing on a traffic-related stop before he was publicly known as the bombing suspect, and federal authorities had taken him into custody on April 21, 1995, hours before he was expected to make bail on a state firearms charge. Nichols had surrendered in Harrington, Kansas, after learning he was being sought by the FBI. The indictment took those investigative threads and moved them into court. For listeners following the arc of the case, the timing is important. April 19th was the bombing. April 21st was the federal arrest of McVeigh. Nichols surrendered after learning he was wanted. Then, on August 10th, the grand jury acted. Less than 4 months separated the blast from the formal federal indictment of McVeigh and Nichols. In that span, the case moved from catastrophe to identification, from identification to custody, and from custody to charges. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General later described the structure of responsibility in plain terms. McVeigh devised the plot and planted the bomb, while Nichols and Michael Fortier were indicted for crimes relating to the bombing and bomb. Fortier pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement. That summary is useful because it shows how the prosecution was not only about who was present at the Murrah Building when the Ryder truck detonated. It was also about conduct surrounding the bombing: planning, assistance, knowledge, and responsibility. Still, the central federal trial would focus most visibly on McVeigh and Nichols. Their names had become the names attached to the prosecution. One had been stopped on the road before investigators knew who they had. The other had surrendered in Kansas as the search widened. Both had military histories, and both were connected in the documented geography of the case through Fort Riley, Kansas. The previous chapter traced the ideological background: Waco, Ruby Ridge, anti-government anger, and the places the National Park Service identifies as part of the broader story. The indictment shifted the emphasis from background to proof. That shift is one of the quiet but essential movements in any major criminal case. Public understanding can form quickly, especially after mass violence. Rumor can move faster than evidence. Suspicion had already gone wrong in the first hours after the bombing, when attention wrongly focused on Middle Eastern terrorist groups before moving toward McVeigh and Nichols. The federal prosecution had to operate in a different register. It had to take a case born in shock and place it under rules: evidence, admissibility, charges, defense, witnesses, jurors, and verdicts. The courtroom would not be a memorial. It would not be an investigative command center. It would be the place where the government had to prove its case. But there was another problem built into the location. Oklahoma City was the site of the bombing. The victims lived, worked, worshipped, and were mourned there. Survivors, rescuers, federal employees, families, and ordinary residents had experienced the explosion not as a national headline, but as a wound in the center of their own city. The prosecution began there, with the grand jury indictment, but the trial itself would not remain there. On February 20th, 1996, the federal trial venue was changed from Oklahoma City to Denver, Colorado. That move placed distance between the site of the attack and the courtroom where the evidence would be heard. It did not remove Oklahoma City from the case. Nothing could do that. The Murrah Building, Northwest 5th Street, the dead, the injured, the damaged blocks, and the survivor community remained at the center of what had happened. But the legal proceeding now moved west, away from the immediate physical and emotional landscape of the bombing. Denver became the trial setting for the federal prosecution. The change of venue is a procedural fact, but in this case, it carried narrative weight. It showed how the justice system had to respond to a crime that had saturated an entire community. The case could not be separated from Oklahoma City, yet the trial would be conducted somewhere else. The record of the bombing would be brought into a federal courtroom in Colorado through testimony, documents, physical evidence, expert analysis, and the work of lawyers on both sides. By then, the investigation had already established a vast archive. OKBOMB had generated more than 28,000 interviews and more than 43,000 leads. Investigators had collected more than 3 tons of evidence. They had searched more than 13.2 million hotel registration records, reviewed more than 3.1 million truck rental records, and searched more than 682,000 airline reservation records. Those numbers describe scale, but the trial would require selection. Not every lead becomes testimony. Not every record becomes an exhibit. A prosecution must decide what proves the charged case. The indictment in Oklahoma City and the move to Denver together form a hinge in the story. Before them, the federal government had been pursuing a bombing investigation. After them, it was preparing for trial. The work changed shape. Investigators still mattered, but prosecutors now had to organize the evidence into a courtroom narrative. Defense attorneys would test it. A judge would oversee it. Jurors would eventually be asked to decide guilt or innocence based not on the horror of the crime alone, but on the evidence presented in court. That distinction is central to understanding the next phase. The bombing had been one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in United States history. The human facts were never in doubt: 168 dead, 19 of them children, and hundreds injured. The structural facts had been documented: a rented Ryder truck, an ammonium nitrate and fuel oil bomb, catastrophic damage to the Murrah Building, and destruction across the surrounding blocks. The investigative facts had led to McVeigh and Nichols, but the courtroom demanded a narrower question: what could be proven against each defendant under federal law? The answer would come slowly, through trial proceedings in Denver. The indictment had named McVeigh and Nichols. The venue change had moved the case away from Oklahoma City, without moving the memory of the bombing out of it. And the federal prosecution, built from wreckage, records, witnesses, and the long path of OKBOMB, was now approaching the moment when evidence would become verdict. The case that began at 9:02 in Oklahoma City was entering its next formal stage: judgment. Judgment arrived not as a single moment, but as a sequence. The case that had begun with debris on Northwest 5th Street, then moved through OKBOMB, indictment, and a change of venue to Denver, now entered the part of the process where the federal courts separated accusation from proof. The question was no longer whether the bombing had happened, or whether the Murrah Building had been destroyed, or whether 168 people had died. Those facts had formed the ground beneath the prosecution from the beginning. The question in Denver was what federal law could hold each defendant responsible for, and how far that responsibility could be proven. For Timothy McVeigh, the answer came on June 2, 1997. He was found guilty on all 11 federal counts. That verdict carried the weight of the government's theory of the case. Federal investigators had traced the Ryder truck through wreckage and records. They had followed the rear axle to Junction City, Kansas. They had connected the rental truck suspect to McVeigh. They had also established the crucial timing of his arrest. He had been stopped shortly after the bombing on a traffic-related matter before he was publicly identified as the bombing suspect, and federal authorities arrested him on April 21, 1995, only hours before he was expected to make bail on a state firearms charge. By the time the case reached verdict, those investigative facts had been transformed into courtroom proof. Evidence that had once existed as fragments, registrations, witness accounts, and leads became part of a legal record. The federal jury's decision did not restore what had been lost in Oklahoma City, but it did answer the narrow question the court had been asked to decide. Under federal law, McVeigh was guilty on every count brought against him in that trial. The sentencing phase gave the verdict its final legal consequence. On August 14, 1997, Timothy McVeigh was sentenced to death by lethal injection. In a case defined by mass death, the sentence was also a statement about federal power. The bombing had struck a federal building, killed federal employees and members of the public, and turned an ordinary weekday morning in downtown Oklahoma City into a national trauma. The prosecution had unfolded in federal court after a federal grand jury in Oklahoma City indicted McVeigh and Terry Nichols on August 10, 1995. The venue had been changed to Denver, Colorado on February 20, 1996, because the court process had to be conducted outside the city most visibly wounded by the attack. But the authority at work remained federal from beginning to end. McVeigh's execution came in 2001. With it, he became the first person executed for a federal crime in the United States since 1963. That fact placed the Oklahoma City case in a broader legal history. The execution was not only the end of McVeigh's criminal case. It marked the return of federal execution after a long absence. In the public meaning of the case, that mattered. The bombing had already become one of the defining domestic terrorism cases in the United States. McVeigh's conviction, death sentence, and execution placed the federal response to that violence inside the machinery of capital punishment. But the trial outcomes were not identical for the two men named in the federal indictment. Terry Nichols faced a different verdict. On December 23, 1997, he was convicted of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter in the federal trial. He was acquitted of weapons and explosives charges. That split verdict matters because it shows the court separating levels of culpability. In the public memory of the bombing, McVeigh and Nichols are often named together. They had both been former United States Army soldiers. The National Park Service places Fort Riley, Kansas, within the broader geography of the case, and that is where McVeigh and Nichols had met while entering the Army. Nichols later surrendered in Harrington, Kansas, after learning that he was being sought by the FBI. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General states that McVeigh devised the plot and planted the bomb, while Nichols and Michael Fortier were indicted for crimes relating to the bombing. Fortier pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement. In court, however, shared association was not the same as identical liability. Nichols was convicted of conspiracy, which recognized his role in the broader criminal plan. He was also convicted of involuntary manslaughter, but the federal jury did not convict him on the weapons and explosives charges. The outcome was therefore both a conviction and a limitation. It confirmed criminal responsibility while rejecting parts of the prosecution's case against him. That distinction is important in any account of the bombing because the law does not work only through moral certainty or public grief. It works through charges, evidence, instructions, and verdict forms. The attack had killed 168 people, including 19 children. It had injured hundreds more. The blast had damaged more than 300 buildings across a 48-square-block area, according to the Oklahoma Historical Society. NIST later described the structural failure of the Murrah Building in technical terms. The blast destroyed most of the north half of the building's rectangular footprint and caused roughly half of the usable space to collapse. But in the courtroom, even a disaster of that scale had to be translated into count-by-count decisions. McVeigh's verdict was total. Nichols's verdict was partial. Together, they reveal how the federal justice system assigned responsibility after the bombing, not as a single undifferentiated judgment, but as separate findings against separate defendants. For families, survivors, investigators, and the wider public, those legal outcomes could not close the wound. A verdict can establish guilt. A sentence can impose punishment. An execution can end a defendant's life. None of those acts can undo the moment at 9:02 in the morning on April 19, 1995. The absence remained in Oklahoma City, in families, in workplaces, in the footprint of the Murrah Building, and later in the 168 empty chairs of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Still, the legal record became one of the ways the country organized the aftermath. The trials fixed certain facts in a public and institutional form. McVeigh was not remembered merely as a suspect or a figure in an investigation, but as a man convicted on all 11 federal counts, sentenced to death, and executed for a federal crime. Nichols was not remembered simply as a name alongside McVeigh's, but as a defendant convicted of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter, while acquitted of other charges in the federal trial. That precision matters because domestic terrorism often leaves behind a struggle over meaning. The bombing was not an accident, not an unknown explosion, not the work of an outside enemy, as early suspicions had wrongly suggested. It was a deliberate attack carried out within the United States, rooted in anti-government rage, and prosecuted through the federal courts. The verdicts helped define it as such. By the time McVeigh was executed in 2001, the country had already begun reshaping law and security in response to Oklahoma City. The courtroom had answered the question of individual guilt, but the bombing had also forced a second question, one that reached beyond McVeigh, Nichols, and Fortier. How should the federal government protect its buildings, its workers, and the public from the possibility of another domestic attack? The answer would move from verdicts and sentences into policy, security, and legislation, including the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, Public Law 104-132. The verdicts closed one part of the federal response, but they did not close the question Oklahoma City had placed before the country. A criminal case could name defendants, test evidence, and impose sentences. It could establish that Timothy McVeigh had been found guilty on all 11 federal counts, that Terry Nichols had been convicted in federal court of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter, and that Michael Fortier had pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement. But after the courtroom came a different arena: the law books, the security plans, and the everyday design of public space around federal buildings. The bombing had shown that a federal office building could become a target, not in wartime, not on a distant battlefield, but on a weekday morning in downtown Oklahoma City. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building had housed public agencies and routine services. People came there for federal business. Employees came there for work. Children were inside the building. Nearby structures along Northwest 5th Street, including the Athenian Office Building and the Oklahoma Water Resources Building, were wrecked so badly that they were eventually imploded, according to the National Park Service. The Oklahoma Historical Society reports that property damage affected more than 300 buildings in a 48-square-block area. That scale mattered. It made the attack more than a murder case, more than an explosives case, and more than a regional disaster. It raised a national question about the vulnerability of public institutions. The bomb had been placed in a rented Ryder truck near the north side of the Murrah Building. NIST later reported that the structure was not designed to resist blast, earthquakes, or other extreme loading conditions. Its north half suffered catastrophic damage, and the progressive collapse followed the destruction of key supporting columns and a third-floor transfer girder. Those were engineering findings, but they also became public policy warnings. A building could be ordinary and still become a symbol. A street could be open and still become a route for attack. The federal response took more than one form. It included investigation, prosecution, and punishment. It also included legislation. In 1996, Congress enacted the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, known as Public Law 104-132. GovInfo describes it as an act to deter terrorism, provide justice for victims, provide for an effective death penalty, and other purposes. That phrasing is formal, almost compressed, but it shows the range of concerns that followed Oklahoma City. Deterrence, victims' justice, capital punishment, and broader federal authority were all placed under the same statutory roof. The timing matters. The act came after the bombing and before the federal trials reached their final verdicts. The legal process against McVeigh and Nichols was still moving through the courts when national policy was already shifting. That overlap shows how the bombing operated on two tracks at once. On one track, prosecutors prepared a case that would be heard after the venue moved from Oklahoma City to Denver, Colorado. On the other, the federal government and Congress responded to the attack as an event that demanded changes in the national legal framework. The title of the law itself reflects the mood of the period. Anti-terrorism placed the bombing inside a national security vocabulary. Effective death penalty connected the federal response to punishment and finality. Justice for victims acknowledged that the dead and injured were not abstractions in a policy debate. The 168 people killed, including 19 children, and the hundreds injured, were the reason the law could not be discussed only in procedural terms. Oklahoma City had forced the country to confront terrorism as something that could be domestic, anti-government, and aimed at federal civilian life. That point was especially important because the first public suspicions had been wrong. As earlier chapters traced, Britannica notes that immediate suspicion wrongly focused on Middle Eastern terrorist groups before attention shifted to McVeigh and Nichols. The Oklahoma Historical Society states that early media accusations against Islamic terrorists contributed to 2 days of anti-Muslim hysteria. The later federal case established a different reality. The perpetrators were tied to an anti-government worldview, and the bombing became a defining example of domestic terrorism in the United States. Policy after Oklahoma City had to reckon with that fact. The threat was not only foreign. It could grow inside the country, speak the language of grievance against the federal government, and choose a federal building as its target. The bombing also changed the way federal buildings were seen. Before April 19, 1995, a federal office building could be understood primarily as a place of administration. Offices, records, appointments, casework, benefits, law enforcement agencies, and public access. After the bombing, the same kind of building also had to be understood as a possible target. That did not erase its public purpose, but it complicated it. Federal buildings are not fortresses by nature. They are often built to serve citizens. The Murrah Building had been part of the civic fabric of downtown Oklahoma City. Its destruction showed the danger of that openness when a large explosive device could be driven close to the structure. This is where the engineering record and the law enforcement record meet. NIST's findings about the building's collapse gave the physical explanation of how the blast moved through the structure. The FBI's OKBOMB investigation showed how the attack had been planned, executed, and traced back through evidence, debris, vehicle parts, rental records, interviews, and leads. Congress's 1996 law represented another kind of record, the written record of national response. Together, they show that the federal government responded not through a single institution, but through a network of institutions, investigators, courts, lawmakers, engineers, and public officials responsible for the security of government spaces. The phrase federal response can sound distant. In practice, it meant reacting to a blast that had reached far beyond the Murrah Building. It meant processing more than 3 tons of evidence, as the FBI reports, and following more than 43,000 leads. It meant trying defendants in federal court after the case was moved to Denver. It meant passing a law described by GovInfo in terms of deterring terrorism and providing justice for victims. And it meant renewed attention to the physical security of federal buildings, the kind of attention that comes after a public place has been violently redefined by what happened there. That attention did not bring back the lives lost at 9:02 in the morning. It did not undo the collapse of the north half of the building or the damage across a 48-square-block area. But it marked an institutional recognition that Oklahoma City had exposed a weakness. A truck bomb had been brought close enough to a federal building to destroy it. A domestic attacker motivated by rage at the federal government had killed workers, visitors, and children. A criminal trial could punish the guilty, but policy had to ask what might prevent another attack, or at least reduce the chance that one could produce the same devastation. There is a tension inside that response. Security can protect, but it can also change the feeling of public space. Law can deter, but it also carries the weight of punishment and authority. After Oklahoma City, those questions became part of the national conversation around terrorism and government power. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 did not stand apart from that conversation. It was one of its central legal expressions, a statute shaped in the aftermath of a bombing that had made domestic terrorism impossible to treat as an exception or a remote possibility. By the time McVeigh was executed in 2001, the federal response had already taken form in court judgments, in statute, and in the security thinking surrounding public buildings. Yet the most enduring answer to Oklahoma City was not only legal or architectural. The law could name crimes. Security could reconsider risk. Engineers could explain collapse. Investigators could reconstruct the path of the Ryder truck and the evidence that followed. But the city still had to decide how to hold the absence left behind. On the footprint of the Murrah Building, that absence would be given a public shape. Not as a statute and not as a courtroom record, but as a memorial organized around the number that policy could never fully contain, 168. The question left at the end of the federal response was not whether Oklahoma City would remember. It was how. Courts had produced verdicts. Congress had produced law. Security officials had reconsidered the risks around public buildings. But none of those answers could make a public place for grief or give form to the absence left where the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building had stood. That work began close to the disaster itself. The Oklahoma Historical Society reports that a memorial task force had formed by July of 1995, only months after the bombing. It later became part of the Oklahoma City National Memorial Foundation. The timing matters. Before the trials were complete, before every legal conclusion had been reached, the city was already facing a different obligation: to protect memory from being swallowed by procedure. A criminal case asks who did what and what punishment the law permits. A memorial asks another question. It asks what a community owes to the dead, to the injured, to the survivors, and to the public record after violence has turned an ordinary workday into a permanent point of reference. The answer in Oklahoma City was built on the footprint of the Murrah Building itself. The Oklahoma City National Memorial includes 168 empty chairs. They stand where the building once stood, and they make the scale of the loss visible without trying to explain it away. Each chair represents a person killed in the bombing, not a statistic, not a count inside an indictment. A person. The design is quiet, but it is exact. The National Park Service says the chairs are arranged in 9 horizontal rows, representing the 9 floors of the federal building. That structure of rows matters because it keeps the memorial tied to the place as it was before the blast. The Murrah Building was not only a symbol of the federal government. It was an office building with floors, agencies, workers, visitors, appointments, routines, and a daycare center. Its ordinary geometry became, after the bombing, part of the language of remembrance. The rows of chairs turn that geometry back toward human presence. They ask a visitor to understand the loss floor by floor, not as an abstraction, but as an absence arranged across the ground, where people had been at work. The memorial does not reconstruct the building. It does not restore the north half that collapsed. It does not try to make the site appear whole. Instead, it uses the building's own footprint to show what cannot be rebuilt. There is another detail in the arrangement, one that can be easy to miss if the chairs are seen only as a single field. 5 chairs are placed outside the main organizational pattern. They honor the 5 people killed outside the Murrah Building. That decision prevents the memorial from narrowing the story too tightly around the structure itself. The bombing destroyed the building, but the violence did not stop at its walls. The surrounding blocks, the nearby streets, and the people outside the federal offices were also part of the human field of harm. Earlier in this story, the damage across downtown Oklahoma City had been described through buildings and blocks. The Oklahoma Historical Society reports that property damage affected more than 300 buildings in a 48-square-block area. The National Park Service says that the Athenian Office Building and the Oklahoma Water Resources Building across Northwest 5th Street were wrecked and eventually imploded, and that 16 buildings in total were taken down after the bombing. Those facts tell one version of the impact: the radius of destruction, the broken glass, the damaged structures, the buildings that could not remain. But the 5 chairs outside the main pattern tell that same truth in a more intimate way. They mark that people were killed beyond the building's interior. They keep the memorial from becoming only an architectural memory. The attack took place in a city, on a street, in a shared public environment. The memorial reflects that. The site also includes the Survivor Wall. According to the research record, the Survivor Wall contains names of survivors within a 2-block radius and incorporates 4 granite slabs salvaged from the Murrah Building. Like the chairs, the wall carries both fact and meaning. It names survival, but it does so with material taken from the damaged building itself. The granite slabs are not replicas. They are salvaged pieces. They connect the present memorial to the physical structure that was attacked on April 19, 1995. In that way, the wall holds 2 kinds of evidence at once. It preserves material from the Murrah Building, and it preserves the names of people who lived through the bombing within the surrounding 2-block area. That radius is important. Survival, like loss, was not confined neatly to one address. The blast crossed streets, entered nearby buildings, and turned the area around Northwest 5th Street into part of the event. The Survivor Wall acknowledges that the bombing created concentric circles of injury, trauma, and memory. Some people were inside the Murrah Building. Some were nearby. Some were rescuers. Some were family members who came later and waited. The wall does not tell all those stories individually, but it makes space for the fact that survival itself became part of the permanent record. The memorial's power comes from restraint. It does not need to dramatize the attack. The event had already been dramatic in the most terrible sense. The task of the memorial is different. It slows the visitor down. It asks for attention to names, placement, scale, and material. It uses empty chairs, rows, salvaged granite, and the building's footprint to create a form of public memory that is precise enough to teach and quiet enough to mourn. That precision is essential because the Oklahoma City bombing has often been remembered through large categories: domestic terrorism, anti-government extremism, federal prosecution, national security, public law. Those categories are necessary. They help explain how the attack happened, how investigators responded, how the courts reached judgment, and how the federal government changed afterward. But a memorial resists allowing those categories to become the whole story. 168 empty chairs return the narrative to the people who were killed. The 9 rows return it to the floors of the building where they worked, visited, waited, or were cared for. The 5 chairs outside the main pattern return it to those killed beyond the building itself. The survivor wall returns it to those who lived and to the damaged materials that remained. In the broader history of crime and power, the Oklahoma City bombing stands as a warning about what domestic extremism can become when grievance turns into violence and when a public institution becomes a target. It also stands as a warning about the speed of false suspicion, the difficulty of investigation, and the long reach of a single act into law, architecture, policing, and public memory. But the final ground of the story is not the courtroom in Denver, or the statute books, or the investigative files of OKBOMB. It is the memorial in Oklahoma City, where absence has been arranged so that it cannot be ignored. The chairs are empty because the people they represent are gone. They are visible because the city chose not to let that absence disappear into time. And they are numbered, in the deepest sense, not because a number can hold a life, but because the country must be made to face the full count of what happened there. 168 people were killed. 19 were children. Hundreds were injured. More than 300 buildings were damaged. Those facts remain part of the historical record. Yet on the footprint of the Murrah Building, the record becomes something quieter and more difficult to pass by. A chair for each life. Rows for the floors. 5 set apart for those outside. Granite from the building itself. Names of survivors within the 2-block radius. This is where the episode ends, not with the bomber, not with the blast, and not with the machinery of punishment, but with the public shape of memory. The Oklahoma City National Memorial does not erase the violence that made it necessary. It does not offer an easy closing. It holds the loss in place and asks everyone who comes after to look carefully, to remember accurately, and to understand that the measure of the crime was never only the force of the explosion. It was the empty chairs left behind,